Hello everybody and welcome to this new episode of Books Up Close. Hope you're all doing well and keeping healthy. So this week we are talking about Garth Greenwell's novel Cleanness from 2020. And now I say novel and we'll get into the book's form shortly. If you don't know, Garth Greenwell is a fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop. His previous books include What Belongs to You from 2016 and before that the novella Mitko from 2011, which formed the first part of What Belongs to You. Greenwell was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and moved to Bulgaria to teach literature, but has just recently moved back. And this relationship between the US and Bulgaria is something that he explores through all of his books. So I say novel, but that term is not what Greenwell uses to call this book. He prefers to call it a kind of cycle of material, not even a kind of short story collection, because all the stories contain the same character at the same point of time. And by the way, it's the same character from his previous work, What Belongs to You, and it's an unnamed American teacher living in Sofia, Bulgaria. Now, while the idea of the song cycle, which he's kind of taken from opera, is a really interesting one, where kind of all the parts are interrelated and speak to one another and have these kind of formal harmonies back and forth, I think we could quite easily call it a novel, not least because the idea of the novel has always been quite a broad, capacious one. So since its very beginning, the word novel, obviously meaning new, has been something that encompasses new forms, new ideas, new ways of telling story. And I think we've seen that across the previous reviews we've looked at as well, all of the books using form in very complicated ways. That's a kind of theme that's emerged through this Books Up Close journey, which is a journey attending to the textuality of books, right? How they're written, how they come to be. Cleanness has 9 sections, each of which, as I say, has a kind of almost corresponding part. So part 1 and part 9 speak to each other in particular ways. So what Greenwell himself and many reviewers have said is that the book is largely about sex. And while that's true, I don't want you to think that that's the only theme in this book, but rather politics, shame, identity, nationhood, pedagogy, friendship, revolution, all of these things are kind of central to the book. So even though there are some kind of explicit chapters, particularly the ones about BDSM that foreground the idea of bodies and sex, those chapters or sections or stories, whatever you want to call them, are as much about power and gender and those kind of dynamics rather than just the act of sex itself. So these 2 sections, Gospodar and The Little Saint, are the 2 that speak to each other across the idea of BDSM and what it means to participate in a sexual act, that are the ones that have had the most discussion around them. So there's a very interesting review by Sigrid Nunez, who's the author of The Friend, among many other books. She has a really, really interesting review of Greenwell's work that I suggest you read, in which she says actually that second chapter almost becomes boring because the sex doesn't really say much beyond itself. And I don't know if I agree with that, but it's an interesting thing to think through about whether these depictions of sex actually speak to something much larger about humanity, the way in which we engage with others. The most interesting sections for me include the very middle part called The Frog King. And now this was previously published in the New Yorker, so you can find that online as well. But The Frog King is a really beautiful and sensitive depiction of 2 characters who in the book kind of form a relationship, but there's lots unspoken, there's lots unsaid drifting through that relationship, and it's as much about people finding themselves in cities unanchored and unconnected to things, so they go on holiday to Italy and various things happen. And I won't say much more about that, but I think that's one of the more coherent and really beautiful sections of the book. So for me, this book is really beautiful. Greenwell's sentences are always praised as being really poetic and drawn out. He writes in a very kind of modernist way, in the sense that he's trying to use prose to get at something like consciousness, where you follow someone's thought through the sentence, through the clauses, even as that thought changes and shifts back and adds new kind of meaning to it. So he's following in the tradition of people like Henry James, who Greenwell often talks about, as well as people like Proust and Woolf and so on. However, I don't want to limit his prose to just that. I think he's doing something in his writing that those writers aren't doing. He's more attentive to a kind of realism than Proust might be, but that's a story for another day, I guess. What I want to suggest is that while the prose here is very thoughtful, very lush, very meditative, I don't think it is as engrossing as in What Belongs to You. I think that book was far more condensed, far more focused and succinct in a way, even though the page length is not that different, but that book had far more kind of unity between its form and content. So you had part 1 and part 3, which were about the narrator's relationship to Mitko, and then the middle section was where we have this flashback to the protagonist's childhood in Kentucky, which is told through one paragraph long 40-page section. The book formalized the idea of this kind of overwhelming return of the past in a really interesting way. The more fragmentary nature of Cleanness, I think, to me, is less convincing or has less coherence to it, and you feel like you're just getting these kind of fragments of a story, which is no bad thing, of course, but in comparison to that other book, it feels much. And therefore, in comparison to that book, I think this one, Cleanness, is a little less taut. There are some interesting parts of this book that were not present in the previous ones, such as there's more of a kind of political backdrop. So there's the idea of revolution kind of bubbling under the surface. There's queer rights in Bulgaria. There are various things happening. Yet there's also this strange, persistent wind coming from Africa, which you get in a few of the sections. So this kind of hot, warm, dusty wind keeps rising from North Africa to Bulgaria. And it seems to be a kind of harbinger of something. I don't know, to me it felt strangely racialized in an odd way, this kind of like threat of otherness coming from the south, coming from the continent of Africa upwards, that I'm not entirely sure what to do with. Let me know if you have any thoughts on that. But as a kind of metaphor, it comes in a few times and it felt odd, felt out of place. But one of the things the book does really well that I'll mention in this capacity is that it talks about teaching in really interesting ways. It talks about how a kind of creative writing or literature teacher passes something on to their students but doesn't know the ramifications or the effects of those things. So I think as a teacher myself, you really see that idea in quite an interesting way, especially in the first chapter where the narrator says something along the lines of you kind of pass on something and not know how it will affect those students, if at all. So in all, I think this book is really beautiful, it's really sensitive, it's a really engaging read. You'll read it very quickly if you pick this up. But if you do like it, I would suggest you read What Belongs to You as well, because I think it's a much stronger book. So for that reason, I'm giving this 4 out of 5, only because it doesn't have quite the same kind of unity as the predecessor, but it's still a fantastic read, and I hope you get around to it. Let me know what you think of the book in the comments. Share your review with me. I really like it. You've been sharing your ideas and I really appreciate those. Also, like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and pass this on to people you know. And until the next video, happy reading and stay well. See you soon.